give the floor to Matteo Bonelli. Thanks for accepting governing the invitation. Ready where you are, Matteo.
Yes, thanks a lot, Giuseppe, for the invitation. Two kind words, and thanks also to Giacomo for the organization of the event. It's always a pleasure to be here in Pisa. Let me see whether I'm able to share the slides. Yes, I am. Maybe, yes. That should work. So yes, well, again, thanks. And what I want to do today is to discuss, well, not a paper yet, but an idea of a paper that I have, on which I started working a couple of months ago, which is on, well, I struggle with the title and then I change it. It's on the primacy of judicial independence. The focus is on the domestic effects of the Court of Justice case law on Article 19 TEU. So I'm interested in this paper, as I will explain in a moment, to see a dimension that has been, I think, so far relatively unexplored in the discussion on judicial independence in EU law, which is not so much on, for example, the enforcement of the Commission and the Court of judicial independence standards on the member states, but rather the effects of the judgments of the Court in domestic legal orders and how this has shaped, I think, the line of jurisprudence of the Court in recent times. So why I want to do this? Well, I've looked at the last few judgments of the Court, especially in the Romanian context, but also, as I will mention later, in the Polish ones. And there were a few statements that triggered my attention. So in the Eurobox judgment, this is the second decision of the Court in preliminary references concerning the independence, inter alia, of the Romanian judicial system, but also already the domestic effects of the judgments of the Court. Well, the Court said in one paragraph that the power to do everything necessary when applying EU law to disregard national rules or a national practice which might prevent EU rules from having full force, etc., constitutes a guarantee that is essential to judicial independence as provided for in the second subparagraph of Article 19(1) TEU. So I think this is new. It starts from something we already know. So the power to do everything necessary, it's a spillover of Simmental, to disregard national rules and apply instead EU rules. But now this is linked by the Court of Justice to the concept of judicial independence. So the power of this application and to give full effect to EU law becomes connected to judicial independence. The background of Eurobox is a decision of the Romanian Constitutional Court that asked lower Romanian courts not to, in fact, disapply national law and apply Article 19 in cases where the Romanian Constitutional Court had already found domestic judicial independence arrangements in line with EU law. So the Romanian Constitutional Court wanted to preserve a monopoly on assessing the compatibility of Romanian law with EU law. In the next judgment of this Romanian saga, the Court continues with similar statements. So Article 19, read in conjunction to primacy, precludes national rules or practices under which, in fact, ordinary courts of a member state have no jurisdiction to examine the compatibility with EU law of national legislation, which that constitutional court had found to be consistent with a national constitutional provision. So here again, we have this conflict between the Romanian constitutional courts and lower Romanian courts. And the Court of Justice, again, protects the powers of lower courts. Again, this is not new. It's a long-standing line of case law of the court, as I will say later. But this is does not only derive from primacy, but becomes an issue explicitly also of judicial independence, and it is also linked to the preliminary reference procedure. In the Polish context, in the last infringement action that the Commission had launched, this is on the so-called muscle law, or it goes on the French name now. It's becoming more and more complex to identify the cases. Now, these have, for a reason or another, French names. Again, the first complaint of the Commission is that's by prohibiting national courts from reviewing compliance with of Polish courts with the requirements of the tribunal established by law under Article 19 and 47. Poland has failed to fulfill its obligation under Article 19, under Article 47, 267, and the principle of primacy. So I think what is new here is really that the principle of primacy becomes an obligation that can be enforced in infringement actions. I think there was one previous case, which was in the German TSPP case, in which the Commission had started an action based on primacy. But now in this case, and then in the forthcoming case on K3/21, so the decision of the Polish Constitutional Tribunal on the primacy of challenging the primacy of EU law, now the Commission tried to operationalize the principle of primacy read in conjunction with Article 19. The decision is of last week or the week before, so a couple of weeks ago. It's not available in English, so my French is sketchy. So I've not studied in detail, I will not say much, but then again, the court, in contrast with the Advocate General, also claims that in fact the Polish master law, which prevented lower court, or tried to prevent lower courts to assess the compatibility of other courts with the requirements of EU law, of judicial independence, is also in contrast with the principle of primacy. This is just a recollection of what the principle of primacy entails. And then, because of the direct effect of Article 19, then national courts must apply EU law, Article 19, and these apply national law. And therefore, there is a breach of the principle of primacy. So it's, I think, to my knowledge, is the first judgment in which, in an infringement procedure in which the court declares a breach of the principle of primacy by a member state. So this was a bit the starting point. And from there, I started to wonder, you know, what is this about? Or what causes this? And then to see that, in fact, I think in the latest waves of judicial independence case law on Article 19, we see more and more a focus, not so much on the substantive standards of maybe we should move this a bit, of judicial independence. So it's not the court fleshing out those standards, identifying benchmarks and parameters, but it's really on the cases have to do with the national court's powers to use EU law in domestic legal orders. And what I wanted to assess, what I wanted to study, is how the court is actually responding and dealing with these new waves of cases in which, next to the judicial independence standards, we have more traditional, maybe, questions of direct effect, primacy, and disapplication. And in fact, yeah, from there I started looking at this domestic effect and impact. So I wanted to tell the story of the judicial independence case law, not so much from the perspective only of the Court of Justice or only of the enforcement of those standards over the member states, but to see this more procedural dimension of this line of case law. So in fact, the hypothesis is that this line of case law is disruptive not so much, or not only for the substantive content of the decisions of the court, but also because the Court of Justice makes full use of the procedural toolkit of EU law. With that I mean direct effect, primacy, and disapplication. And this is what produces a disruption in domestic legal orders, this empowering of lower courts through the traditional channels of EU law. And then from there, I developed the paper into, or I am developing the paper into three main parts. So I look back, in fact, at the first wave of cases, which already says very interesting things on direct effect and primacy. This has been perhaps slightly overlooked in the debate, and to focus really on how the case law of the court has strongly empowered national courts. Then I look at what I defined, and have also a bit of a different paper on that, this domestic reaction. So In fact, we have seen in Poland and in Romania, but also to some extent in Hungary, a bit of a challenge to primacy and to the case law of the courts. So there is a domestic attempt, not only of national courts, but also of the legislator, especially in Poland, to disempower national actors. So to prevent that the case law of the court is to limit these effects, these domestic effects of the case law of the court. And then to look at how in the latest waves of cases, we see in fact these issues of primacy and judicial independence becoming more and more intertwined. And they are intertwined when they arrive before the court, and the court then further intertwines this. And then the final question, which is also what I'm still fighting with, is what is new? Is there really anything new in the case law of the court? What is the impact of these decisions? Do they tell us new things? I don't know yet, but let's see. Okay, let me go back. So there is a story often told, and I've told it myself a couple of times, so it's not exciting or very new, that of course in the Portuguese judge's case, the Court of Justice developed a new interpretation of Article 19. It brings new issues, the structural judicial questions under the purview of the court. They become clearly a question of EU law. And this allows the Commission to then, for example, enforce these standards of judicial independence, the principle of judicial independence, in a number of infringement actions. For example, on the Polish Supreme Court, and then on the Polish ordinary courts, and more and more. Next to this line of, let's say, institutional cases, Commission v. Poland, we also have preferences by domestic courts, by Polish domestic courts, that try to act in defense of the independence of the domestic judiciary. And this is also has been studied a bit in how national actors use Article 19, the court new interpretation of Article 19, to try to protect the domestic judiciary. Yeah? So the independence of the judiciary, their own independence, in fact. What I think has escaped to some extent our attention is that in order to do so, or in order to offer a tool of self-defense to national courts, it was necessary for the Court of Justice to, in fact, grant, first of all, direct effect to Article 19, which was not a given, I believe. If you read the provision, it's not one of those traditional provisions that you would say clearly are clear, precise, and unconditional. They require action by the member states, but we know that this is not an obstacle to direct effect. And what is interesting is that if you look at the first judgments, at the Portuguese judges' ruling, but also AK and AB, those were the first decisions on judicial independence in Poland. The court says that Article 19 is clear, precise, and unconditional, even without explicitly saying that it has direct effect. But this is what essentially the court implied. And this has now become more explicit in Eurobox arrests, and then most recently, as I showed, in Commission v. Poland 4, on the Master law, we see that now it is clear that direct effect has direct effect. Article 19 has direct effect. Why is this important? Well, we know since, at least since Poplaski 2, that in fact direct effect is necessary for primacy. So the primacy follows from direct effect. And then that means also this application of national law in conflict with EU law, and the application of instead EU law, of the EU law norms. What is already remarkable from the very beginning is what this means in practice, concretely. Because of course, it is one thing to apply domestic procedural provisions. It is another to say that Article 19 as direct effects can be used by national courts. And in fact, what the court had to explicit as to flesh out in AK and AB was already the consequences of finding direct effect and primacy of Article 19. The court says, well, instead of the Polish reforms of the judiciary, national courts in those cases, so this was, for example, the non-capture court and chamber of the Supreme Court of Poland, they could disapply the new reforms and, through the direct effect of Article 19, acquire jurisdiction to decide on specific cases, including, for example, disciplinary cases. So the direct effect in primacy leads to this application and to these courts reacquiring, because they had it in the past, jurisdiction over a certain issue. This is not unprecedented. We have seen similar cases, but already remarkable that through Article 19, a provision that is still fairly general, these courts are able to acquire jurisdiction to decide on a specific case. Then, in this Jurek case of WZ, the Court of Justice goes even a step further. Here, direct effect and primacy do not simply lead to this application of national law, in this case of a national decision taken by a court that cannot be considered a tribunal established by law under EU law standards, but it leads to the nullity of judicial decisions delivered by those judges that are not a court or a tribunal established by law. So this is very rare. We know of few exceptional cases in which the court has recognized this remedy of nullity, as Michael Zugan called it in an article on Common Market Law Review last year. But it's more than the standard buffering of this application. It requires to simply consider that decision taken by a judge who is not a judge according to EU law, cannot be considered a tribunal established by law, to consider it null and void, non-existent. There are different, and the novelty is evident if you look, in fact, at the different translations. But in English, the language is that of nullity, in other languages of non-existence. So, to make sense of this first part of the sentence, we see that through this procedural toolkit, so not only the substantive standards, but also the use of a strong version of the procedural toolkit of EU law, there is an empowerment of national judges who really become guardians of EU judicial independence standards in domestic legal orders. This does not go well with certain constitutional authorities and with certain also political actors in a couple of member states. So what we see after these first rulings, so after AK and D, is an attempt of higher courts and political actors to resist and contest the Court of Justice case law. It's a bit the usual suspects, even if I think the Romanian story, as I will say in a moment, is a different one. So we see the introduction of legislation or also judgments of higher courts that try to really limit this lower court's reliance on EU judicial independence standards. And also, and this is a story I decided to leave a bit outside my paper, to limit judicial dialogue with the Court of Justice. And one of the key ways to do so is to use, in a strategic way, disciplinary liability regimes. Again, the Polish example is the most remarkable one, but we've seen this also, for example, in Hungary, and this was already the case in Romania, that courts that lower courts that, for example, disobey a ruling of a higher court or of a constitutional courts in order to apply EU law, or the judges who do so can be punished, can be investigated, and of course the justification that is fleshed out is, well, sense of legal certainty and of judicial hierarchy. The actual reason is, of course, it's attempt to disempower, to limit, in fact, the domestic effects of EU law. This is what I say. Now, of course, I think there are two things. One is that there is a use in this judgment, essentially, of the Polish Constitutional Court in these infamous K321 judgments, but also of the Romanian Constitutional Court. This is a case of end of 2021 as well. So they use the classical, if you want, high-level arguments that constitutional courts have often used to resist to the primacy of EU law. So, well, the interpretation of Article 19 is ultra vires. The domestic constitution as primacy or is superior to EU law, because this is where, of course, the authorization for EU integration is contained. And especially in Poland, but also in Romania, there are references to the national identity. This is a bit the standard arguments. But if we look a bit closer to what they are doing, these courts, is that there is also, I think, and I don't want to necessarily defend those courts, but I think we can also see more precise or more specific concerns for this, the level of disruption that in domestic legal orders is created by the case law of the court. Again, this is not a defense because the real origin is not the case law of the court, but it's domestic reforms that undermine the independence of the judiciary. But we see that, for example, what the Polish Constitutional Court really was trying to do was to disempower lower national courts. And in Romania, the situation is again a bit different, even if it's sometimes associated with the attempts of Polish Constitutional Courts to really resist the EU law. I've seen colleagues sometimes even saying, calling it a constitutional court in quotation marks. I think this is an independent court, which can be taken seriously, unlike the Polish Constitutional Tribunal that we know it's not an independent court anymore, and it's statutory court, and it's used by the political actors to pursue specific objectives. And I think this is the old trend, relatively the story of the marginalization of constitutional courts. I think the word of marginalization has been used, for example, by Jan Komary, where the Romanian Constitutional Court, what the Romanian Constitutional Court is resisting is the possibility that EU law offers to lower courts to escape the attempts or escape domestic constitutional review and use, let's say, European judicial review instead. Because the Romanian Constitutional Court had assessed that those standards that then also ended up for the court were compatible with the Romanian Constitution and with the EU law. And now it was trying, in a way, to prevent this second route. It's a story that we have told, and I think we have seen phenomenal attempts to escape this also by established constitutional courts in Germany, Italy, France, and so forth. So I think the story of the conflict between domestic constitutional courts and the Court of Justice in this specific context of the independence of the judiciary can be understood if we complement the traditional narrative of these high-level constitutional arguments with that also of these more specific or more mundane concerns with how the case of the court is disrupting, let's say, domestic logics. Of course, these conflicts end up again before the Court of Justice. And then in the new waves of cases, we see, again, the court continuing to flesh out standards, but also to having to deal with these domestic constitutional conflicts. National courts continue to ask the support of the Court of Justice, not so much here to tackle new reforms of the judiciary, but to actually prevent domestic attempts by courts and by the legislator to limit their possibilities to rely on EU law. So they want the court's support in protecting the domestic effects, again, of EU law and the Court of Justice case law. The court approaches does a number of things, and I think they are not fully fleshed out doctrines, and we'll come back to this in a moment, but it's starting to bring together different discourses. So it first defines the power of this application as a guarantee essential to judicial independence. Now, the power of this application, as I mentioned already, is not new. It derives from a long-standing line of case law, which goes back to Simmental, traditionally. And the court is most often framed in rather absolute terms. Any national court is able at any stage of the proceedings to disapply national law that is in conflict with a directly effective provision of EU law. I was presenting this paper once, and a colleague, Maris Cremona, said, well, Simmental was already about judicial independence, which I think is exactly true, but it was never presented as such. And now the Court of Justice essentially goes the next step and say, well, the power of this application is in fact essential to judicial independence, is a part of the independence that judges have of their own independence. Article 19 and the principle of primacy are really read more and more together to protect the power of national courts to disapply and give effect to EU law. This is essentially, these Romanian judgments are you see the intertwinement within these two lines of cases. And I think, as I will say later, there is sort of a mutual reinforcement between the two. Primacy supports judicial independence, and judicial independence supports primacy. And the court is emphasized also that under no circumstances there can be disciplinary liability for judges who apply EU law and disapply national law, or rather, disapply national law and apply EU law, and or request linear references. So the court really reads this in absolute, fairly absolute terms. So we see, I think, mutual reinforcement between these two lines of cases, and the tool of disciplinary liability that, as I mentioned earlier, was used or has been used by national actors to disempower national courts, has been sort of framed in categorical terms by the Court of Justice as something that is a no-go under EU law. Let me try to make a sense of this story. So I don't think we're seeing, and this I want to be careful because I don't want to claim that this is a revolution in the Court of Justice case law. So this is the Court of Justice builds on standards established position on primacy in its application, but also, for example, on the rights to refer preliminary questions. This has also been seen always in rather absolute terms. Of course, under certain conditions, national proceedings can be preferred, melty, but still at any stage of the proceedings, even after receiving a response of their higher courts, national courts, lower national courts are always able to disapply and or to send a preliminary reference. And this is the standard position. Or rather, yeah, I think sometimes the court has been more nuanced. And for example, also because Orlando is there, I would be interested in seeing where Randstad fits in this picture. But we can come back to this in the discussion. But let's say the standard position is put in fairly absolute terms. But I think that if we look closer, there is ground for meaningful innovations in this primacy of judicial independence line of cases. So as I mentioned earlier, the clear one is the remedy of nullity. We have seen this very few times in very exceptional situations. This Rimsevich case, famously the court declared the national acts relating to the system of central banks null and void. Michael Jugan also uses the example of the latest Berlusconi decision of the Court of Justice, but here it is framed in the Jure case in more general terms. I haven't mentioned it because again, it's maybe yet another paper, but especially in Eurobox and RS, we also see that in this line of cases and in this attempt to strengthen primacy, the court also relies on new constitutional foundations of the principle of primacy. Essentially, the court refers to Article 4.2, the principle of equality of member states, as the treaty basis or one of the treaty bases for primacy. This is, I think, well, not I think, this argument was formulated first in the famous press release after the PSPP case of the German Constitutional Court, and has been an idea suggested by the very president of the Court of Justice in academic writing. And also Declaration number 17, which, as we know, is not legally binding, but reaffirms that the member states have accepted the principle, the case law of the court and the principle of primacy. And these two, well, one is treaty provision, the other one is a declaration attached to the treaties, are put by the courts are added by the courts to the standards formula on primacy. So in a sense, this contestation of primacy and the need to strengthen primacy have been used by the court to develop further, justifications for the principle of primacy. I think what we see in general is a strong emphasis on primacy and the obligations deriving from 1947, from EU law in general, over national procedural autonomy. That's where I suggest to speak today of procedural autonomy today is really, I agree with what Bobek argued already a few years ago, that this is a misnomer. It's not autonomy anymore. So I think we see more and more a shift in the balance. There are EU law requirements. If those EU law requirements are fulfilled, then the member states still have a margin of maneuver, of discretion. But to speak of really autonomy as the starting point of the debate, I think this is becoming more and more, or gives a false impression if we use that expression. Especially in the last wave of cases, we see really this mutual reinforcement between 267, Article 19, Article 37 of the Charter, and privacy. And I'm trying to make sense of this. Or does it change anything? Does it play a role? I think there are two dimensions to it. First, a robust reading of primacy allows, and this is fairly intuitive, judicial independent standards to become a living reality in the member states. The court empowers all national courts to resist possible domestic reforms of the judiciary by relying all on EU law. But I think judicial linking the two also allows primacy to become stronger, in a sense that primacy in this application are framed as guarantees of judicial, as belonging to judicial independence. And this is a way to tackle primacy challenges, because if EU law grants judicial independence or guarantees judicial independence, that means that then in turn, primacy becomes grounded on provisions of EU primary law. So in a sense, I think an attempt, which is only sketched by the court, but it's not fully fleshed out, to see in Article 19 CJEU really the treaty basis for primacy, and to resolve then once and for all the debates on whether resistance to primacy or challenges to primacy are possible under EU law. So it's linking the two allows to ground primacy in the treaties. The version of primacy, with that I mean the version of primacy that the court promotes of absolute primacy, of unconditional primacy. So I think there is this mutual reinforcement. Again, I don't think this is per se anything new. The court has never recognized a doctrine of controlimity or of counter limits in that sense, and has allowed in some cases to limit primacy, but of course. But here the court linking it to Article 19 and to judicial independence, I think this could serve the purpose of allowing you to enforce primacy and allowing you to present it as the correct vision and version of primacy. So I think the court continues to go or doubles down on this logic of empowering domestic courts. It doesn't see any limits in this empowerment. So I think, for example, I didn't mention this earlier, but I think it was in the previous slides. So while sometimes, for example, legal certainty can be a limit to primacy, here it isn't. The hierarchy of national judicial orders have been in some senses recognized as a possible way to nuance primacy. I think Randstad again could be an example, but not for the judicial independence line of case law. So it's this mutual reinforcement between these two lines of cases. Now, I jump in. Again, this is very preliminary. I'm still very much reflecting. So any comments or question or even request for clarification maybe could help. I also have myself a few open questions. These are not whether would ever be the paper. These are questions for myself, but I do wonder whether what we see is always convincing. This absolute version of primacy and some absolute version of judicial independence. I think, for example, this use of Article 19 in the RS case, which again was a conflict between national lower courts and the Romanian constitutional courts, is always fully convincing. So here I wonder whether Article 19 should, in fact, be used in a context in which we have fully independent fully independent constitutional courts that try to limit. And I think, of course, this is a problem under EU law, but I don't know whether it should be solved through Article 19, whether when these courts try to limit the possibility of lower courts to rely on EU law and prefer instead domestic avenues and standards of constitutional review. So I wonder whether it's true that the power to disapply constitutional court decisions in conflict with EU law really can flow, as the court presented, from Article 19 and from judicial independence, and not from primacy, as we have always known. So I wonder whether this continuous interplay between primacy and Article 19 is in fact desirable and correct, and I wonder what this would mean in contexts where we don't see any problem with judicial independence. The second is, it seems to me that the court now throws its principles and provisions at times without a clear understanding of the value of each element in this construction. So it refers to a number of provisions next to each other: Article 19, Article 47 of the Charter, Article 267, and the principle of primacy. But it's hard to point out, and I think this also links back to the first question, what is the value of each of those elements in the court construction? In a sense, we have seen this confusion also in the Commission arguments in the last infringement action, in which the Commission also attempted to rely to claim that Polish law was in breach of all of these provisions. The opinion of the Advocate General actually rejected separate reliance on Article 267 and preferred to stick to Article 19. But then in the judgments, as far as I read, the court has supported rather the Commission position and has actually, as I mentioned earlier, found a breach of the principle of primacy as well. But then it's not clear what each of those components adds to this construction. I think in any event, there is a need to develop and define those doctrine. And I think the Advocate General Bob, still back Advocate General in Eurobox, also made clear that there is a need to find clear limits in the doctrines that the court has developed. I think there is this interesting and stimulating reminder and importance that the function of the court is not to adjudicate on interinstitutional challenges, even if this is actually what the court in many cases has to do in the end of the day. But I think that tells us that there is a need for caution, and especially on the translation of these judgments on judicial independence in complex contexts to less problematic ones. Bobek also speaks that EU law gives a license to disagree to lower national courts, but not to completely disregard higher courts. This is, again, an important concern with legal certainty and with certain structuring of domestic legal orders. And I think we can see in the judgment, in the sense of to what extent EU law gives national lower courts the power to completely, in fact, again, disregard judgments of higher courts and the structure of domestic legal orders. My sense is that the court also, and this I go back again to Ranza, which is again a bit outside of my paper, but this inspiring things. The court is trying to distinguish, in a sense, problematic context to non-problematic context, but it has not defined the borders yet. And I think the three questions are fairly similar. I think that there is a need to define when each of those elements, 19, 267, primacy, 47, can and should be used, and when they shouldn't. And I think in shifting from national procedural autonomy to EU law obligations, the standards of Article 19, there are of course dangers which have been pointed out by many, and I think there the court also needs to reflect on a question that is at the same time an old one and also a new one. And I think what is new, maybe in this case, is really what this is about. This is about institutional structures of member states. And it's about fairly general principles of EU law, the principle of judicial independence, which are used to reshuffle completely, in some cases, the jurisdiction of courts. The jurisdiction of courts now can gain jurisdiction through EU law, through Article 19, which is also not completely unprecedented, but also new. And I think there is a need to, in fact, develop and refine those doctrines and to find a way to distinguish contexts where EU law should, in fact, prevail over any type of procedural autonomy, of domestic autonomy, in cases where instead the courts and then EU law should leave more space for national diversity of constitutional arrangements. And perhaps the enforcement of EU law, if need be, can be done through other means, including state liability, infringement procedures, and so on. Again, this is very much work in progress. Thank you for your attention. Thanks again to Giuseppe and to Giacomo for inviting me. Always a pleasure, and I look forward to the discussion.
Matteo,